Some folks think loneliness is just about being alone, but Silas McGraw knew better. It was about forgetting what it felt like to matter to another human being. After losing his wife and child to fever 3 years back, he'd retreated deep into the Colorado wilderness, convinced that solitude was safer than risking his heart again. But fate had other plans when he stumbled upon Clara Whitmore that sweltering July morning in 1847. She was fighting a broken wagon wheel in the blazing sun, determined and stubborn as a mule. When this grizzled mountain man stepped from the shadows, his blunt words shocked her. What he did next surprised them both. Their meeting would spark something neither expected in the harsh frontier. Two broken souls would discover that sometimes love finds you when you're not looking for it. But would their bond survive when Clara's dangerous past catches up with her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains of Colorado Territory had a way of stripping a man down to his essence, and Silas Grizzly McGraw had been stripped bare. 3 summers running. At 42, he carried the weathered look of someone who'd stared down nature's worst moods and lived to tell about it, though telling wasn't something Silas did much of anymore. His cabin sat tucked into a grove of towering pines, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. He'd built it with his own hands, after the fever took Margaret and little Thomas, every log placed with the desperate precision of a man trying to build something permanent in a world that had proven everything could vanish overnight. The simple gold band that once graced his ring finger now hung from a leather cord around his neck, hidden beneath his buckskin shirt like a secret too painful to display, but too precious to abandon. Some mornings, when the light caught the cabin walls just right, he could almost hear Margaret humming while she kneaded bread, could almost see Thomas chasing that old hound dog around the clearing. But those moments passed quicker than mountain, a mist, leaving him with nothing but the steady rhythm of survival that had become his prayer. Silas rose before dawn most days, checking his trap lines and hunting the game trails that wound through the dense forest surrounding his sanctuary. He knew every rock, every stream, every deer path for 20 miles in any direction. The wilderness had become his scripture, each season teaching him lessons about endurance, patience, and the bitter truth that nothing lasted forever. Not the brutal winters that tested a man's resolve, not the brief summers that reminded him why living was worthwhile, and certainly not the people who made life worth the struggle. But on this particular July morning, something felt different in the air. Maybe it was the way the wind carried sounds from the valley below, or perhaps it was just the restlessness that sometimes seized a man who'd been alone too long with his thoughts. Whatever it was, it drew him from his usual routine toward the ridge that overlooked the narrow pass where the old trading route snaked between the mountains. That's where he first spotted the smoke. It wasn't the thick, dark column of a forest fire, or the steady grey ribbon of a well-tended hearth. This was the frustrated puff of someone fighting a losing battle with wet wood and precious little patience. Silas crouched behind a cluster of boulders, his practiced eye taking in the scene below. A single wagon sat canted at an awkward angle, its right rear wheel obviously busted. A woman, though from this distance he couldn't make out much more than her determined movements, was wrestling with what appeared to be a broken axle. Even from 100 yards away, he could see the set of her shoulders spoke of pure, stubborn resolve. She'd shed her bonnet in the heat, and her dark hair had escaped whatever pins held it, creating a wild halo around her head as she worked. Every few minutes she'd stop, wipe her face with her sleeve, and survey her predicament with the kind of careful assessment that told Silas this wasn't some helpless city woman expecting rescue. This was someone who understood the hard mathematics of frontier survival. Figure it out yourself or face the consequences. For nearly an hour he watched her work. She tried leveraging the wagon with a branch that snapped under the weight. She attempted to dig out rocks from under the broken wheel with her bare hands until her knuckles bled. When that failed, She sat back on her heels and stared at the problem with an expression that mixed frustration with calculation, never once calling for help that wasn't coming. Something about her refusal to quit stirred memories Silas had tried to bury along with his wedding ring. Margaret had possessed that same stubborn streak, that same refusal to accept defeat even when circumstances seemed hopeless. It was what had convinced her to marry a rough trapper and follow him into the wilderness, and it was what had kept her fighting the fever right up until her last breath. The woman below was fighting her own battle now, and despite every instinct that screamed at him to remain hidden, to preserve the solitude that had become his armor against further loss. Silas found himself moving down the slope. She heard his approach. Her hand moved instinctively toward what he presumed was a concealed weapon, and her body tensed with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust strangers. Smart woman. The frontier was littered with the bones of folks who'd been too trusting. "Easy there," he called out, raising his hands to show they were empty. Just a neighbor offering help. Up close, she was younger than he'd expected, maybe 25 or so, with the kind of beauty that suggested she hadn't been born to this hard life. Her dress, though dusty and sweat-stained, was well made from good fabric. Her hands were soft, despite the fresh scrapes from her wagon repairs. This was a woman with a story, someone who'd chosen the frontier rather than been born to it. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They held depths he recognized, the kind of shadows that came from seeing too much, losing too much, carrying burdens too heavy for someone her age. They were eyes that had looked into darkness and refused to blink. "I can smell your sweat, woman," he said, the words coming out more blunt than he'd intended. It was true enough. The July heat had her working up a considerable lather, but he immediately regretted the crude observation. She stiffened, clearly prepared to deliver a sharp response, but before either of them could think better of it, something primal took over. Maybe it was the way her chin lifted in defiance, or the flash of fire in those wounded eyes, or simply the fact that he'd been alone too long with nothing but ghosts for company. Whatever it was, he stepped forward, cupped her face in his rough hands, and kissed her. It wasn't gentle or romantic. It was desperate and hungry and completely inappropriate. It tasted of salt and surprise and something electric that shot through him like lightning striking dry timber. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, she kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt as if anchoring herself against a storm. Then reality crashed over them both. She pushed away, her hand flying to her lips, eyes wide, with shock and something else, something that wasn't entirely displeasure. He started, then stopped. There weren't words for what had just happened. No explanation that would make sense of the lightning that had passed between two strangers on a dusty trail in the middle of nowhere. "My name's Silas McGraw," he said instead, settling for the simple truth. "And I reckon you could use some help with that wheel." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read his intentions in the lines carved there by weather and grief. Finally, she nodded. "Clara Whitmore," she replied, her voice steadier than he'd expected. "And yes, I could use the help." As he knelt beside the broken wagon, examining the damage with practiced hands, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had just shifted in his carefully ordered world. The wheel could be fixed. That was just a matter of skill and proper tools, but whatever had sparked between them in that moment of contact, whatever had made him abandon 3 years of careful isolation for the taste of a stranger's lips, that was something else entirely, something that might prove far more dangerous to repair than any broken wagon wheel could ever be. The wagon wheel took them the better part of 2 days to repair properly. Silas had the tools and the know-how, but Clara insisted on learning every step of the process, her quick mind absorbing the lessons with an intensity that spoke of someone planning for a future where help might not be available. She worked alongside him without complaint, even when the mountain sun turned merciless and sweat stung the cuts on her hands. "You heading somewhere particular?" Silas asked on the second. Afternoon, as they fitted the new wheel onto the axle, he'd straightened with careful patience. Clara's hands stilled on the iron rim. "West," she said simply, "away from what was." It was the kind of answer that invited no follow-up questions, and Silas respected that. The frontier was full of people running from something. Debts, scandals, broken hearts, or worse. A person's past was their own business until they chose to share it. But as evening settled over their makeshift camp, Clara began to open up in small ways. She'd been traveling alone for 6 weeks, she told him, sleeping in the wagon and buying supplies in the scattered settlements when she could find them. She was a fair cook despite the limitations of trail rations, and she had a way of making even hardtack and beans taste like something approaching civilization. "You're welcome to rest up at my place," Silas offered, as they watched the stars emerge. Above the mountain peaks, "Got room for the wagon, and the cabin's more comfortable than sleeping rough." Clara studied his face in the firelight. "That's generous. What would it cost me?" The question carried weight beyond simple payment, and Silas recognized the wariness of someone who'd learned that generosity often came with strings attached. "Nothing you don't want to give," he said simply. "Just company for a few days, if that suits you." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she nodded. "I'd appreciate that." The next morning, they loaded her few possessions into the wagon and made the slow journey up the mountain to his cabin. Clara said little during the climb, but he caught her studying the landscape with the careful attention of someone memorizing escape routes. Smart woman, he thought again. His cabin looked smaller, with another person in it, but Clara moved through the space with quiet efficiency, taking in the sparse furnishings and practical arrangements without comment. She set her worn leather Bible on the small table by the window, the only personal item she unpacked, and Silas caught a glimpse of pressed flowers and folded letters tucked between the pages before she closed it reverently. That first night, she woke screaming. Silas bolted upright in his loft bedroom, reaching for the rifle he kept beside his bed before his mind caught up with his instincts. Below, Clara thrashed against blankets that had become enemies in her dreams, crying out words he couldn't quite catch. When he climbed down to check on her, she came awake with a gasp, her hand flying to the small derringer she'd somehow managed to draw from beneath her pillow. "Easy," he murmured, the same tone he'd use with a spooked horse. "Just me. You were dreaming." Clara's breathing gradually slowed as she oriented herself to the cabin's shadows. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to wake you. Nothing to apologize for. We all carry things that visit us in the dark." She looked up at him then, really looked, as if seeing something in his face that convinced her he spoke from experience. "Do yours ever stop coming?" "Sometimes they quiet down," he said honestly, "but they never go away completely." The nightmares came 3 more times over the next week. Each time, Silas would find himself climbing down from the loft to sit with her until the shaking stopped and she could breathe normally again. He never asked what she dreamed about, and she never volunteered the information, but he began to piece together fragments. Something about running, about men with cruel voices, about shame that clung to her like smoke from a dirty fire. During the days, they fell into an easy rhythm. Clara insisted on earning her keep, taking over the cooking and mending, while Silas worked his traplines and hunted. She had a gift for making his crude bachelor quarters feel more like a home, adding small touches that spoke of a woman's eye. For comfort, wildflowers in a tin cup, his few books arranged neatly on the shelf, meals that actually tasted like food instead of mere fuel. But it was the small intimacies that began to undo him. The way she hummed while she worked, unconsciously, echoing Margaret's old habit. How she'd pause in her sewing to watch him whittle by the fire, her expression soft with something that looked dangerously like affection. The careful way she tended the cut on his hand when he slipped with his skinning knife. Her touch gentle but sure. 2 weeks into her stay, Silas was organizing Clara's belongings to make space in the cabin when he found it tucked between the pages of her Bible, a folded piece of paper that fell open in his hands before he could stop himself from seeing what it contained. Wanted. For theft, $500 reward. Catherine Walsh, age approximately 24, brown hair, brown eyes, about 5'4" in height. Wanted in connection with theft of $2,000 from Caldwell and Associates, St. Louis. Contact Sheriff's Office if seen. The sketch was rough but recognizable. Clara Whitmore was Catherine Walsh, and she was worth $500 to someone with flexible morals and a willingness to haul her back to Missouri. Silas stared at the poster for a long moment, his mind working through the implications. $500 was more money than most men saw in 2 years. It would buy supplies to last through several winters, maybe even enough to start over somewhere new if a man had a mind to leave the mountains. But as he looked up to find Clara, standing in the doorway, her face pale with the knowledge of what he'd discovered, Silas realized that all the money in the world wouldn't be worth the look of betrayal in those dark eyes. "I can explain," she said quietly. "No need." He folded the poster and handed it back to her. "Your business is your business, Silas. Unless you want to tell me," he added, meeting her gaze steadily. "In which case, I'm listening." Clara sank onto the bench beside the table, the wanted poster trembling in her hands. "My name really is Clara. Clara Catherine Whitmore. I only used Catherine Walsh because it was my mother's maiden name, and I thought it might throw them off the scent." She took a shaky breath and began to speak, the words coming out in a rush as if she'd been holding them back too long. "She'd worked as a bookkeeper for Henry Caldwell's shipping business in St. Louis," she told him. "Good work, respectable work, the kind that let a woman support herself without depending on others. But Caldwell's son, William, had developed an unwelcome interest in her, following her home, making crude suggestions, cornering her when his father wasn't around. I tried to handle it quietly," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Told him I wasn't interested, started working different hours to avoid him. But men like William Caldwell don't hear no very well." The assault happened on a Thursday evening when she'd stayed late to finish the monthly accounts. William had been drinking, celebrating some business success, and he decided her continued refusal was just playing hard to get. When she fought him off and threatened to tell his father, he'd laughed. "Who's going to believe a hired woman over a Caldwell?" he'd said. "Besides, I've been watching you work with those books. Real careful with numbers, aren't you? Maybe too careful. Maybe been moving some of those numbers around for your own benefit." Within a week, money had gone missing from the company accounts, exactly the amount needed to make Clara look guilty of embezzlement. William's assault became her word against his, and with the theft charges hanging over her head, no one was inclined to believe a desperate woman trying to escape justice. "I knew what would happen if I stayed," Clara said, her hands twisted together in her lap. "They'd railroad me into prison, or worse. So I took what little money I had saved and ran. I've been running ever since." Silas absorbed this information. In silence, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. He'd known men like William Caldwell, sons of privilege who took what they wanted and left others to pay the cost. The thought of such a man putting his hands on Clara, of frightening her so badly that she'd fled into the wilderness alone, made something dark and violent stir in his chest. "You believe me?" Clara asked, and there was such vulnerability in the question that it nearly broke his heart. "I believe you," he said simply. "Question is, what do you want to do about it?" Clara laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "What can I do? It's my word against a wealthy man's son, and I'm the one with a price on my head. The best I can hope for is to disappear so completely that no one ever finds Catherine Walsh." "And Clara Whitmore?" Silas asked. "What happens to her?" For the first time since she'd begun her story, Clara's composure cracked completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she buried her face in her hands. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know if Clara Whitmore gets to have a future or if she just keeps running until there's nowhere left to run." Without conscious thought, Silas crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. She came to him easily, her face pressed against his chest, as 3 weeks of held-back fear and loneliness finally found their outlet. He held her while she cried, one hand stroking her hair, the other rubbing gentle circles on her back. "Hey now," he murmured against the top of her head. "Nobody's taking you anywhere you don't want to go. Not while I'm breathing." Clara pulled back to look at him, her eyes red with tears, but also something that might have been hope. "You do. That hide someone the law wants?" "The law wants Catherine Walsh," Silas corrected. "Far as I know, no such person exists. There's only Clara Whitmore, and she's welcome to stay in these mountains as long as she likes." The kiss that followed was different from their first, softer, deeper, tinged with gratitude, and something that felt dangerously like love beginning to bloom. When they broke apart, Clara rested her forehead against his, and Silas could feel some fundamental shift taking place in both their hearts. "Thank you," she whispered. "Nothing to thank me for," he replied. "We all deserve a chance to start over." But even as he spoke the words, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that Clara's past wouldn't stay buried as easily as they both hoped. $500 was a lot of money, and there were plenty of men in the territory who wouldn't hesitate to collect it, regardless of guilt or innocence. Still, for now, they were safe in their mountain sanctuary. And for the first time in 3 years, Silas McGraw found himself thinking about the future in terms of we instead of I. It was a dangerous kind of hope, but as he watched Clara carefully fold the wanted poster and place it back inside her Bible, he decided it was worth the risk. The hunting knife felt familiar in Clara's hands, though she'd never held one quite like it before. Silas had crafted the handle himself, carving intricate patterns into the wood that spoke of winter evenings spent perfecting something both beautiful and deadly functional. The blade gleamed in the morning sunlight as he demonstrated the proper grip, his larger hands guiding hers with patient precision. "It's not about strength," he explained, adjusting her stance. "It's about knowing where to place the blade and having the will to follow through. A woman your size can drop a man twice. Your weight if she knows what she's doing." Clara absorbed the lesson with the same intensity she'd brought to learning wagon repair. Everything was different now that her secret was out in the open. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent, as if sharing the burden had somehow lightened its weight. More importantly, she no longer felt the constant need to look over her shoulder or plan her next escape route. For the first time in months, she was allowing herself to think beyond mere survival. "Why are you doing this?" she asked as they took a break from knife work to practice with the rifle. "Teaching me to fight, I mean. You could have just let me hide here until I got restless enough to move on." Silas considered the question while he loaded cartridges, his movements automatic from years of practice. "Because hiding isn't living," he said finally. "And because I've got a feeling your past isn't done with you yet. Better to be ready for it than caught defenseless." The rifle lesson went better than knife work. Clara had steady hands and a good eye, and within an hour she could hit a man-sized target at 50 yards more often than not. Silas found himself remembering Margaret's complete inability to handle firearms. She'd flinched every time she pulled the trigger, and her shots had gone everywhere except where she'd aimed. The comparison should have felt disloyal, but instead it simply highlighted how different the two women were. Margaret had needed protection. Clara was learning to protect herself. "You're a natural," he said, as she placed 3 shots in a tight grouping on the bark target he'd carved into a distant pine. "Few more weeks of practice, and you'll be as good as any man in these mountains." Clara lowered the rifle, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Is that your way of saying you approve of women who can shoot?" "I approve of anyone who can take care of themselves," Silas replied. "Tends to make for better partnerships when both people bring something useful to the table." The word partnership hung in the air between them, carrying implications neither was quite ready to voice. They'd been careful around each other since the night she'd told him the truth, dancing around the growing attraction that sparked every time they accidentally touched or caught each other staring. Clara slept in the main room, while Silas kept to his loft, but the cabin felt smaller each night, charged with unspoken possibilities. The change came 3 days later, when Clara slipped on the wet rocks while fetching water from the stream. Silas heard her cry out and found her sitting in the shallow water, clutching her ankle with tears of pain and frustration streaming down her face. "Just twisted it," she said through gritted teeth when he knelt beside her. "Give me a minute and I'll be fine." But when she tried to put weight on the foot, her leg buckled immediately. Silas scooped her up without ceremony, ignoring her protests, and carried her back to the cabin. The ankle was already swelling, and by evening it had turned an impressive shade of purple. "Probably be a week before you can walk on that properly," Silas observed, as he wrapped the injury with strips torn from one of his old shirts. "Maybe longer." Clara leaned back against the pillows he'd arranged for her, frustration evident in every line of her body. "I'm sorry. I know I'm supposed to be helping around here, not laid up like an invalid." "You're not an invalid, you're hurt. There's a difference." Silas settled beside her on the narrow bed, close enough to check the bandage, but careful not to crowd her. "Besides, gives me an excuse to take care of you for a change." Something in his voice made Clara look up, really look, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Without quite meaning to, she reached up and traced the scar that ran along his left temple, a memento from some long-ago accident. "Or fight, Silas," she whispered, and he leaned into her touch like a man starved for affection. The kiss that followed was inevitable, soft and questioning at first, then deeper as Clara's arms came up to circle his neck. This wasn't desperation or impulse like their first kiss had been. This was choice, deliberate and considered, and full of promise. When they broke apart, Silas rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "Clara, I know," she said softly. "Me too." They talked through the night, sharing pieces of themselves they'd kept carefully guarded. Silas told her about his childhood in Kentucky, about learning to hunt and trap from his grandfather, about the war with Mexico where he'd served as a scout and learned that killing was sometimes necessary, but never easy. Clara spoke of her parents, both dead now, and her younger sister who'd married a banker and moved to California. She'd been alone in the world even before William Caldwell had destroyed her life, but somehow that made the sanctuary Silas offered feel even more precious. "I never thought I'd want this again," Silas admitted as dawn began to lighten the windows. "After Margaret and Thomas died, I figured that part of my life was over. Seemed safer that way." "Safer, maybe," Clara agreed, her head pillowed on his shoulder. "But not much of a life." "No," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Not much of a life at all." The week of Clara's convalescence changed everything between them. Forced proximity became chosen intimacy as they learned each other's rhythms and habits. Clara discovered that Silas hummed while he cooked, old ballads he'd learned from his mother. Silas learned that Clara read voraciously, working her way through his small collection of books with an appetite that suggested long years of intellectual hunger. They played cards in the evenings, using dried beans for stakes, and Clara proved to have a talent for poker that made Silas laugh more than he had in years. She cheated outrageously, palming cards with the dexterity of a professional gambler, then batting her eyelashes innocently when he called her on it. "A woman has to use every advantage available to her," she said primly, dealing another hand from what was clearly a stacked deck. "Is that what you call it?" Silas grinned, watching her delicate fingers manipulate the cards with obvious skill. "And where exactly did a respectable bookkeeper learn to cheat at poker?" Clara's smile turned mysterious. "I may have had a more colorful past than my employment record suggests." It was on the 5th day that Running Wolf appeared. Silas heard the approach long before Clara did. His friend moved with the silence of his Cherokee ancestors, but there were signs for those who knew how to read them. A shift in the pattern of bird calls, the way the horses in the small corral lifted their heads and turned toward the tree line. By the time the lean, dark-skinned man emerged from the forest, Silas was already standing in the cabin doorway, rifle held casually, but ready. "Brother," Running Wolf said in English, raising one hand in greeting. He was perhaps 50 years old, his face weathered by decades of outdoor living, his long black hair streaked with silver. He wore a mix of native and settler clothing. Buckskin, pants, cotton shirt, beaded vest that spoke of his heritage. "Been wondering when you'd show up," Silas replied, relaxing visibly. "Come in. There's coffee and someone I'd like you to meet." Running Wolf's dark eyes took in Clara with the quick assessment of someone long accustomed to evaluating strangers. She bore the scrutiny calmly, meeting his gaze directly without the nervous fidgeting many white women showed around Indians. "This is Clara," Silas said simply. "Clara, my friend Running Wolf, best tracker in the territory and about the only man I trust completely." "Ma'am." Running Wolf nodded respectfully, but his expression remained guarded. "Silas speak of you in town. Say he has guessed." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "You were in town?" "Gold Creek Trading Post," Running Wolf confirmed. "Many strangers there, men asking questions about woman traveling alone." The coffee cup slipped from Clara's suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor. Silas was beside her instantly, his hand on her shoulder, but his attention was focused on his friend. "What kind of questions?" he asked, his voice deadly. "And quiet. They have paper with drawing. Not good drawing, but close enough. Offer $20 for information." Running Wolf's expression hardened. "I tell them nothing, but others might talk." $20 was more than most men in Gold Creek. "Made in a month." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the walls of their mountain sanctuary beginning to crumble around her. "How many men?" Silas asked. "Two that I see. Maybe more. They have look of men who hunt people for money, bounty hunters." Clara had known this. Day would come, but somehow she'd allowed herself to hope that the vastness of the Western Territories might swallow Catherine Walsh completely. Now reality was intruding on the fantasy she and Silas had been building together. "We need to get her out of here," Silas said, already moving toward the gun rack. "Tonight, before they pick up the trail." "No." Clara's voice was steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I won't run anymore. I can't keep running forever." Both men turned to stare at her. Silas's face showed a mixture of admiration and exasperation, while Running Wolf looked openly skeptical. "Clara, these aren't lawmen," Silas said carefully. "They're bounty hunters. They don't care about guilt or innocence, just the reward money. If they take you back to Missouri, then I'll face whatever comes," Clara interrupted. "But I won't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, and I won't drag you into danger because of my past." Silas knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "You're not dragging me anywhere. This is my choice, too." "Two men, you say?" Clara asked Running Wolf, ignoring Silas for the moment. The Cherokee nodded. "Hard men. They carry many guns. Then we make sure they don't get a chance to use them," Clara said simply. She looked up at Silas, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. "You said I needed to learn to protect myself. I guess it's time to put those lessons to use." Running Wolf studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You have. A courage, woman. Courage and foolishness often look the same from outside. The difference is whether it works out or not," Clara replied with a small smile. Silas squeezed her hands gently. "If we're going to do this, we do it right. No unnecessary risks, no heroes. We plan it careful and execute it perfect." "I have some information about these men," Running Wolf offered. "Their names, their habits, and I know trails they don't. If you truly mean to make stand here, I help." Clara felt something loosen in her chest, not the fear, which remained sharp and present, but the terrible isolation that had defined her life since fleeing St. Louis. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Silas, whose steady presence had become her anchor, and now Running Wolf, whose loyalty to his friend apparently extended to her by association. For the first time since seeing that wanted poster, Clara Whitmore began to believe she might actually have a chance at the future she'd been afraid to dream about. Clara's sewing kit had been her mother's, a small tin box that held memories along with the practical tools of domestic life. The needles were still sharp, the thread still strong, and as she worked to mend the tears in Silas's favorite shirt by lamplight, she found herself thinking about the peculiar turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she'd been Catherine Walsh, respectable bookkeeper, living in a boarding house and planning a quiet, solitary future. Now she was Clara Whitmore, learning to shoot and fight alongside a man who made her heart race every time he smiled. The cabin had undergone its own transformation over the past month. What had once been a stark bachelor's retreat now showed the touches of a woman's presence, curtains sewn from fabric traded in Gold Creek, wildflowers arranged in mason jars, meals that did more than merely sustain life. Clara had discovered a talent for making a home out of very little, and more importantly, she'd discovered she wanted to make this home with Silas. "You don't have to do that," Silas said from where he sat, cleaning his rifle near the fireplace. "I can mend my own clothes." "I know you can," Clara replied without looking up from her stitching. "But I like doing it. Makes me feel useful. Like I'm contributing something beyond being another mouth to feed." "You contribute plenty." Silas set aside the rifle and moved to sit beside her on the bench. "This place has felt more like home in the past month than it has in 3 years. The simple admission made Clara's chest tight with emotion. She'd never realized how much she'd craved this, the quiet domesticity of sharing everyday tasks with someone who mattered, working in comfortable silence, then talking late into the night about everything and nothing. The gradual erosion of the walls they'd both built around their hearts. "Tell me about Margaret," she said quietly, surprising herself with the request. Silas stiffened slightly. "Clara, please, I'm not asking you to compare us or anything like that. I want to know about the woman who made you believe love was worth the risk the first time." Silas was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. Then he began to speak, his voice soft with memory. "She was barely 18 when we met, pretty as a spring morning and twice as stubborn as you are. Her father owned the general store in the settlement where I used to trade my furs. She'd argue with me about everything, the price of supplies, the quality of my pelts, whether I was charging fair rates for guiding parties through the mountains." His mouth curved in a small smile. "I started making excuses to visit that store just so I could argue with her." Clara continued her sewing, giving him space to remember without feeling watched or judged. "Took me 6 months to work up the courage, to ask her father for permission to court her, and another 6 months to convince her I was serious about settling down. She followed me up here with nothing but a trunk full of books and more faith than I deserved." Silas's voice grew quieter. "Thomas came along 2 years later, looked just like her but with my stubborn streak." "What happened?" Clara asked gently. "Fever swept through the territory that winter. Bad one. Took a lot of folks who should have been strong enough to fight it off. Margaret got sick first, then Thomas caught it from her. I tried everything I knew, rode to 3 different settlements looking for medicine, but—" His voice broke slightly. "They died within a day of each other. Margaret went first, and I. Think Thomas just decided he didn't want to stay without his mama." Clara set aside her sewing and took Silas's hand, threading their fingers together. "I'm sorry. For the longest time, I blame myself. If I'd gotten the medicine sooner, if I'd taken them to a real doctor instead of trying to treat them myself, if I'd never brought them to this godless wilderness in the first place." He shook his head. "Nearly drove myself mad with all the what-ifs. Is that why you stayed up here alone? Punishment? Maybe. Or maybe I just couldn't face the idea of caring that much about anyone ever again." He looked at their joined hands, his thumb tracing over her knuckles. "Losing them nearly killed me, Clara. I'm not sure I'm strong enough to survive that kind of loss twice." Clara lifted their joined hands to her lips, pressing a soft kiss to his scarred knuckles. "Then we'll just have to make sure you don't have two." The kiss that followed was different from their others, deeper, more certain, flavored with the kind of trust that came from truly knowing someone. When they broke apart, Silas rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of a man who didn't speak them lightly. "I love you too," Clara whispered back, and felt something settle into place in her chest, something she hadn't even realized was missing. They made love that night for the first time, slow and tender in the firelight. There was no desperation or urgency, just two people choosing each other with full knowledge of the risks involved. Afterward, as Clara lay in Silas's arms listening to his heartbeat, she allowed herself to imagine a future that stretched beyond mere survival. Children, perhaps a larger cabin. Growing old together in these mountains, they were both learning to love. The daydream lasted exactly 3 more days. Clara was in the garden behind the cabin, tending the vegetables she'd planted with careful attention to what would grow at this altitude when she heard the distinctive call of a mountain jay, 3 sharp notes followed by a trill. It was Running Wolf's signal, and from the urgency in the repetition, something was very wrong. She dropped her hoe and moved swiftly toward the cabin, staying low and keeping to the cover of the trees, as Silas had taught her. Inside, she found him already checking his weapons, his face grim. "How many?" he asked without preamble. "The same 2, but they've brought friends," Running Wolf said from his position by the window. "I count 4 riders on the main trail, maybe more hanging back." Clara felt her mouth go dry. 4 men. That's not just bounty hunters anymore. "No," Silas agreed grimly. "That's a hunting party." Running Wolf turned from the window, his expression troubled. "There's more. One of them carries official papers, Deputy Marshal's badge." The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. A deputy marshal meant this wasn't just about bounty money anymore. Someone with real authority wanted her brought back to Missouri. Someone with enough influence to make her disappearance a matter of federal interest. "Henry Caldwell," she whispered. "He must have convinced them I'm some kind of desperate criminal." Silas moved to the gun cabinet, pulling out his Henry rifle and a shotgun. "Doesn't matter what they think. What matters is that they're not taking you anywhere. Silas, if there's a deputy marshal, then he's backing the wrong horse." Silas interrupted. "And he's about to learn that these mountains don't take kindly to folks who mistake might for right." Running Wolf nodded approvingly. "My people have saying, the mountain decides who belongs, not the badge." Clara looked between the 2 men, seeing the determination in their faces, and felt her own resolve strengthen. She'd spent months running from her past, but she was tired of being prey. If Henry Caldwell wanted her badly enough to send federal marshals into the wilderness, then maybe it was time to discover exactly what he was so afraid she might say. "What do we do?" she asked, moving to collect her own rifle. "First, we find out exactly what they want," Silas said. "Maybe they'll be reasonable. And if they're not..." Silas's smile was sharp as his hunting knife. "Then we remind them that hospitality in these parts depends on good manners." Outside, the sound of approaching horses grew louder, mixed with the harsh voices of men accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. Clara checked her rifle one more time, making sure it was loaded and ready. Her hands were steady, she noticed with some surprise. The terrified woman who'd fled St. Louis was still there, but she was no longer in charge. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "I want you both to know that these past weeks have been the happiest of my life." "Save the farewell speeches," Silas said, but his voice was gentle. "This isn't over yet." Running Wolf moved to the back window, positioning himself for a clear field of fire if things went badly. "They stop at Clearing Edge. Want to talk first?" A harsh voice called out from the tree line. "McGraw, we know you're in there, and we know you're harboring a fugitive. Send out Catherine Walsh, and nobody gets hurt." Silas moved to the front door, staying to one side in case someone decided to put a bullet through the wood. "Don't know anyone by that name," he called back. "But you're welcome to state your business like civilized men." "My business is federal law," came the reply. "Deputy Marshal Tom Bridger, and I've got a warrant for the arrest of Catherine Walsh, also known as Clara Whitmore. Send her out, or we'll come in and get her." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. They knew both names now, which meant someone had been very thorough in their investigation. This wasn't just about Henry Caldwell covering his son's crimes anymore. This was about making sure she never got the chance to tell her side of the story. "Show me the warrant," Silas called. "Ride up slow and easy, just you, and let me see." The papers. There was a long pause, filled with the low murmur of men conferring. Finally, "I don't think so, Mountain Man. You send out the woman, or we burn you out." Silas looked at Clara, his eyebrows raised. "So much for reasonable." "Told you," Running Wolf said from his position. "Hard men. They come for blood." Clara moved to the window beside Silas, looking out at the 4 riders positioned at the edge of their clearing. Even at this distance, she could see they were well-armed and professionally equipped. These weren't frontier drifters looking for easy money. They were serious men on serious business. "Last chance, McGraw," the marshal called. "We know she's in there, and we know you're harboring a federal fugitive. That makes you an accessory after the fact." Clara felt the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. These men weren't going to be deterred by words or warnings. They'd come too far and invested too much to leave empty-handed. "There's something else," she said quietly, studying the riders through the gap in the curtains. "Look at their equipment. Those aren't standard-issue weapons for a deputy marshal's posse." Silas followed her gaze and swore under his breath. She was right. The men carried expensive repeating rifles and wore the kind of gear that spoke of serious money behind their mission. This wasn't just law enforcement. This was a privately funded expedition disguised as official business. "Henry Caldwell's reach is longer than we thought," Clara murmured. "He's not just covering up his son's crimes anymore. He's making sure the only witness disappears permanently." The realization crystallized what they were truly facing. These men hadn't come to arrest her. They'd come to ensure she never made it back to St. Louis alive to tell her story. The deputy marshal's badge was just window dressing to make their actions look legitimate. "Then they've made a mistake coming here," Silas said grimly, his hand tightening on his rifle. "These mountains have a way of swallowing up men who overestimate themselves." Running Wolf nodded from his position. "4 men, maybe more in trees. But they don't know this ground like we do. They think numbers make them strong, but numbers make them slow." Clara looked between her 2 protectors. These men who were willing to risk everything for a woman they'd known only a few months. The gratitude that welled up in her chest was almost overwhelming, but beneath it was something harder and more determined. She was done being a victim, done letting other people fight her battles. "How long before they lose patience?" she asked. "Not long," Silas replied. "Men like that don't like to wait. They'll try smoke first, then fire if that doesn't work. Then we don't give them the chance." Clara moved away from the window, her mind working quickly. "There's a way to handle this." Both men turned to look at her, and she saw her own fierce determination reflected in their faces. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, and maybe, just maybe, they would finally put an end to Catherine Walsh's long nightmare once and for all. The trade beads had been Running Wolf's grandmothers, passed down through 3 generations, of Cherokee women who understood that survival sometimes depended on the kindness of strangers. Bright blue and red glass caught the morning light as Running Wolf sorted through them, selecting the ones that would carry the most meaning to his scattered network of friends throughout the territory. Each bead was a message, a call for help, that would travel faster than any horse. "My cousin Greyhawk trades at the Ute camp 2 days north," he explained as he worked. "His wife's brother knows the Arapaho who hunt the eastern slopes. Word will spread. Strangers with badges asking questions about the mountain man's woman." Clara watched the careful ritual, understanding that she was witnessing something far more significant than simple communication. This was how news traveled. In a land where telegraph lines didn't exist, how warnings spread through communities that most white settlers never even knew were there. She was being woven into a web of protection that stretched across tribal boundaries and ancient rivalries. "How long?" Silas asked from his position by the window. The 4 riders had pulled back from the clearing edge, but they hadn't left. Smoke from their campfire was visible through the trees, and the occasional glimpse of movement suggested they were settling in for a siege. By sunset, every native within 50 miles will know about the woman who cooks good food and mends clothes. Running Wolf replied with a slight smile. By tomorrow morning, they'll know about the badge-wearing men who threatened the mountain man who helped Yellow Bear's grandson find his way home last winter. Silas had never mentioned helping anyone's grandson, but Clara wasn't surprised. She'd learned that her taciturn mountain man had a habit of doing good deeds without talking about them. It was part of what had made her fall in love with him. The quiet way, he helped others simply because it was right, not because he expected recognition or reward. "What about the Caldwells?" she asked. "Will word reach them about what's happening here?" Eventually, Running Wolf nodded. "But not soon. The men outside, they came here to disappear you, yes? They don't want anyone in Missouri to know where you are or what happens to you, so they won't send word home until the job is finished." The implication was clear. Whatever was going to happen would be decided here, in these mountains, far from any court or law that might complicate Henry Caldwell's plans. Clara should have found the thought terrifying, but instead she felt oddly liberated. No more running, no more hiding, just the simple clarity of survival. "They'll try to wait us out first," Silas observed, watching the distant camp through his spyglass. "Figure we'll run out of food or water, get desperate enough to make mistakes." "How long can we hold out?" Clara asked. "Food for maybe 2 weeks if we're careful, water indefinitely, the springs protected behind the cabin. But they won't wait that long." Silas lowered the glass, his expression grim. "Men like that get paid to solve problems quickly. They'll try something tonight." Clara nodded, accepting the assessment without flinching. The scared bookkeeper who'd fled St. Louis would have collapsed in terror at the thought of armed men hunting her through the darkness. But that woman had died somewhere along the trail west, replaced by someone harder and more determined. Someone who'd learned to shoot straight and think clearly under pressure. "Then we make sure they regret it," she said simply. The afternoon passed in careful preparation. Silas checked every weapon twice, counted ammunition, and inspected the defensive positions he'd prepared around the cabin. Clara worked on preparing food that could be eaten cold if necessary. If shooting started, they wouldn't be able to risk the light from cooking fires. Running Wolf disappeared into the forest, returning with information about the enemy's positions and movements. 6 men now, he reported as the sun began to set behind the peaks. 2 more came from the East Trail. Professional fighters, not deputy marshals. "Hired guns," Silas said grimly. "Caldwell's not taking any chances." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. 6 armed men against 3 defenders, and one of those defenders was a woman who'd only learned to shoot a few weeks ago. The odds were not encouraging, but as darkness fell and the first stars appeared above the mountain peaks, Clara discovered she wasn't afraid. Nervous, yes. Alert to every sound and shadow, certainly, but not afraid. She had Silas beside her, steady and capable, and Running Wolf watching their backs with the skills of generations of warriors. More than that, she had something worth fighting for, a future that stretched beyond mere survival into the realm of genuine happiness. "You should try to get some rest," Silas murmured, as they settled into their defensive positions for the night. "Could be a long few hours." "So could you," Clara replied, checking her rifle for the 10th time. "When did you last sleep?" "Sleep's overrated," he said with a small smile. "Besides, I've got something worth staying awake for now." The simple declaration made Clara's chest tight with emotion. After years of believing she was alone in the world, she'd found not just love, but belonging. A place where she mattered, people who would fight for her, not because they were paid to or obligated to, but because they chose to. A stick cracked in the forest, too loud and too close to be natural. Running Wolf's soft whistle from his position near the creek confirmed what they all suspected. The waiting was over. "Here they come," Silas whispered, raising his rifle to his shoulder. Clara settled into her position behind the reinforced log barrier they'd built that afternoon, her finger finding the trigger of her Henry repeater. The weapon felt familiar now, an extension of her will rather than a foreign tool. Whatever happened next, she would face it as Clara Whitmore, not as a victim, but as a woman who'd chosen her ground and intended to hold it. The forest around them held its breath, and Clara found herself thinking of her mother's Bible, still sitting on the table inside the cabin. If she lived through this night, she would write a new chapter in that family history, not as someone who ran from trouble, but as someone who stood and fought for the right to exist on her own terms. A shadow moved between the trees, and Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. The battle for her future was about to begin. In the distance, coyotes began to howl, their voices carrying across the mountain valleys like a wild song of freedom. Clara smiled grimly as she sighted down her rifle barrel. She'd come to the wilderness, looking for a place to hide, but she'd found something far more valuable, a place worth defending. Let them come. She was ready. Margaret's locket felt heavier than it should have as Silas held it in his palm, the silver worn smooth by years of his thumb worrying over the engraved surface. Inside, 2 tiny photographs stared up at him, Margaret at 20, her hair arranged in the fashion of the day, and Thomas at 3, gap-toothed and grinning. For 3 years, this locket had been his anchor to grief, his excuse for keeping the world at arm's length. I used to talk to them, he admitted quietly. To Clara, as they sat together in the pre-dawn darkness, waiting for whatever the morning might bring. The attack they'd expected during the night hadn't come, leaving them all on edge and wondering what their enemies were planning. Every night I'd tell them about my day, ask them for guidance, like they were still here, just somewhere. I couldn't see. Clara's hand found his in the darkness, warm and alive and reassuringly present. That's not foolish, Silas. Love doesn't die just because people do. No, but it can trap you, he replied, his voice heavy with hard-won wisdom. I've been carrying this guilt for 3 years, convinced that loving you somehow dishonors their memory. But Margaret, he paused, struggling with words he'd never spoken aloud. Margaret would box my ears for wasting so much time on self-pity. The sun was beginning to lighten the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Clara of the pressed flowers in her Bible. Somewhere out there, 6 men waited for the right moment to attack. But in this quiet space, before the storm, she and Silas were finally addressing the ghosts that had haunted their relationship from the beginning. Tell me about her, Clara said softly. Not the sad parts, the parts that made you love her. Silas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. She laughed at everything, bad jokes, my terrible cooking, the way I'd get tongue-tied trying to say something romantic. She found joy in the smallest things, a successful garden, fresh snow on the peaks, Thomas taking his first steps. His voice grew wistful. She would have liked you, I think, would have appreciated how you refused to give up, how you faced down trouble with your chin up and your spine straight. And Thomas, curious about everything, always asking why and how come, until I thought I'd go mad from the questions. He wanted to know how the mountains got so tall, why the sky was blue, where the wind came from. Silas chuckled softly. Margaret used to say he got that from me, the need to understand how things worked. Clara squeezed his hand gently. They sound wonderful. I'm sorry you lost them, but I'm grateful they were part of making you the man you are. Something shifted in Silas's expression. A burden he'd been carrying finally beginning to lighten. I need to do something, he said suddenly, standing and moving toward the cabin. Will you come with me? Curious, Clara followed him inside and watched as he retrieved a small hand shovel from his tool collection. Without explanation, he led her to a spot behind the cabin where wildflowers grew in cheerful profusion, their colors bright against the morning light. Help me dig, he said simply, kneeling and breaking ground with careful precision. Clara knelt beside him, using her hands to move the soft earth he loosened. They worked in companionable silence until they'd created a small hole, perhaps 6 inches deep. Then Silas removed the leather cord from around his neck and held the locket for a long moment, his lips moving in what might have been a prayer or a farewell. "I love you both," he said aloud, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. "I always will, but I need to love the living now too. I need to build something new without tearing down what we had." He placed the locket gently in the small grave, then began covering it with earth. Clara helped, understanding that she was witnessing something sacred. Not the abandonment of old love, but the integration of it into a larger truth about what it meant to be human. When the task was finished, Silas sat back on his heels and looked at the unremarkable patch of ground that now held his past. "I used to think loving again would mean forgetting them," he said quietly. "But that's not how it works, is it? The heart doesn't have a finite capacity. It just grows bigger." Clara kissed his cheek, tasting salt and earth and the promise of new beginnings. "I love you," she said simply. "All of you, including the parts that belong to them." They were interrupted by Running Wolf's sharp whistle from the forest, 3 quick notes that meant immediate danger. Both of them were on their feet and moving before the sound faded, grabbing weapons and taking positions with the smooth coordination of people who'd learned to work together under pressure. "Movement on the south ridge," Running Wolf called softly as they reached their defensive positions. "They tried to get above us, use high ground for advantage." Silas raised his spyglass and studied the distant slopes. "Smart! They can see our whole setup from up there. Maybe even get a clear shot at the cabin." He lowered the glass, his expression grim. "Time to even the odds. What do you have in mind?" Clara asked, checking her rifle with automatic precision. "We make them think we're where we're not," Silas replied, with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Running Wolf, how long would it take to circle around behind them?" 2 hours if I go alone. 4 if I take her." The Cherokee nodded toward. "Clara! Take me where?" Clara demanded. "You're not staying here while we go off and play soldiers," Silas said firmly. "If this goes bad, I want you somewhere safe." Clara's eyes flashed dangerously. "Safe? Silas McGraw, if you think I'm going to hide in a cave somewhere while you and Running Wolf risk your lives for my problems, you've got another think coming." "Clara, no." Her voice carried the same steel that had gotten her across half the continent alone. "These men came here for me. This is my fight as much as yours." Running Wolf looked between them with obvious amusement. "She has warrior's heart," he observed. "Shame to waste it on hiding." Silas studied Clara's face, seeing the determination there, the refusal to be protected at the cost of others' safety. Slowly he nodded. "All right, but we do this smart, not heroic, no unnecessary risks." "Agreed," Clara said immediately. "What's the plan?" For the next hour, they prepared for what amounted to a tactical chess match played out across miles of wilderness. Using mirrors and reflected sunlight, they would create the illusion of activity around the cabin, while actually positioning themselves to attack the enemy from unexpected directions. It was risky, complicated, and dependent on perfect timing. It was also their best chance of survival. As Clara followed Running Wolf into the forest, moving with the silent efficiency she'd learned over weeks of hunting lessons, she thought about the symbolic burial they'd just completed. Silas had finally laid his ghosts to rest, choosing the future over the past. Now it was her turn to prove worthy of that choice. Behind them, the empty cabin waited in the morning sun, looking peaceful and vulnerable, but appearances could be deceiving in the wilderness, and Clara Whitmore was done being anyone's victim. The hunt was about to begin, and for the first time since fleeing St. Louis, she intended to be the hunter rather than the prey. The bank draft was crumpled and stained with what looked like coffee, but the numbers were still clearly visible when Clara found it in Jake Morrison's saddlebags. $5,000. Not the $2,000 she'd allegedly stolen, not even the $500 bounty she'd seen on her first wanted poster. $5,000 for one woman who'd witnessed the wrong crime at the wrong time. She crouched behind the fallen log, where Morrison had taken his final rest, his unseeing eyes staring up at the mountain sky. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air from the brief, violent skirmish that had ended with 2 bounty hunters dead and the others retreating deeper into the forest. But instead of feeling relief, Clara felt a growing dread as she studied the official-looking document in her hands. "Silas," she called softly, her voice tight with a fear that had nothing to do with the remaining gunmen. "You need to see this." He appeared beside her with the silent efficiency that still amazed her, taking the paper from her trembling fingers and scanning its contents. His face darkened as he read, understanding the implications as quickly as she had. 5,000, he said grimly. "That's not bounty hunter money anymore. That's assassination money." Clara nodded, her throat tight. "And look at the signature." At the bottom of the draft, in flowing script, was written, "Payment authorized by H. Caldwell per agreement with Deputy Marshal T. Bridger." Below that, in different handwriting, was a note that made Clara's blood run cold. "Bring proof of death. No witnesses." "Jesus," Silas breathed. "They weren't planning to take you back alive." The pieces clicked together in Clara's mind with horrible clarity. Henry Caldwell hadn't just been covering up his son's assault, he'd been eliminating the only witness to something far worse. The memory came flooding back, details she'd buried in the trauma of that awful night 6 months ago. "I saw him kill someone," she whispered, the words coming out in a rush. "That night, before William, before he attacked me. I was working late, and I heard voices from Mr. Caldwell's office, angry voices. I thought it was just a business disagreement. So I kept working. But then I heard something crash, and a man screamed." Silas's attention focused on her completely. "What did you see?" I looked through the keyhole of the connecting door. Henry Caldwell was standing over Thomas Brennan, one of his business rivals. Brennan was on the floor, blood coming from his head. Caldwell had this heavy brass paperweight in his hand, covered in... Clara shuddered, remembering. "I thought Brennan was just unconscious." But then Caldwell pressed his fingers to Brennan's throat and smiled. He smiled, Silas, like he was pleased. "And William saw you watching?" Clara nodded miserably. "He came up behind me while I was still frozen at the door, said he'd been looking for me, that his father wanted to discuss my discretion regarding company business, but I could see it in his eyes. He knew what I'd seen. The assault, the theft charges. It was all to discredit me, so that if I ever tried to tell anyone about the murder, they could point to my criminal record and say I was lying to save myself." Running Wolf materialized from the forest, silent, as morning mist. "Other men retreat to high camp. They regroup, plan new attack." His dark eyes took in the dead bounty hunter and the paper in Silas's hands. "But this changes things, yes?" "This changes everything," Silas confirmed, showing him the backdraft. "Clara's not just a witness to assault. She's the only person who can connect Henry Caldwell to murder." "Thomas Brennan," Clara said suddenly, memory sharpening with adrenaline. "He disappeared right after that night. The newspapers said he'd gone on a business trip to California, but he never left St. Louis," Silas finished grimly. "Caldwell killed him and made it look like he'd just moved away." The scope of Henry Caldwell's crimes was staggering. Not just rape and fraud, but premeditated murder, followed by an elaborate conspiracy to eliminate the only witness. Clara understood. Now why the bounty on her head had grown so large, why federal marshals were involved, why professional killers had been hired to hunt her down in the wilderness. "We need to get word back to St. Louis," she said, her mind racing. "If people knew what really happened to Thomas Brennan, who would believe us?" Silas asked reasonably. "We're 3 people living in the middle of nowhere, and one of us is a wanted fugitive. Caldwell has money, influence, bought judges. Our word against his isn't going to be enough. Then what do we do?" It was Running Wolf who answered, his voice thoughtful. "My grandmother used to say, when you cannot win with strength, win with truth. But truth must have teeth to bite. Clara looked at him questioningly. Evidence, he explained. Proof that cannot be bought or intimidated. Something that forces truth into sunlight where it cannot hide. Silas studied the bank draft again, his expression calculating. This is a start. Official authorization to kill an American citizen, signed by both Caldwell and a federal marshal. But we need more. Morrison's other papers, Clara said suddenly. He was careful about documenting everything. Bounty hunters always are, in case they need to prove their legal right to the reward. They searched Morrison's belongings methodically, finding a leather portfolio that contained far more than they'd hoped for. Correspondence between Caldwell and Marshal Bridger detailing the need to permanently resolve the Catherine Walsh problem. Maps showing Clara's probable routes west, with notations about where her body should be disposed of to avoid discovery. Most damning of all, a letter in Henry Caldwell's own handwriting acknowledging that the witness to the Brennan incident needed to be eliminated before she could spread malicious lies about our family. My God, Clara breathed, staring at the evidence of her own planned execution. He really meant to have me killed. Still means to, Silas corrected. These papers prove conspiracy to commit murder, but Caldwell doesn't know we have them. He'll send more men when these don't report back. Unless, Running Wolf said slowly, we make sure he has bigger problems to worry about. Both Clara and Silas looked at him expectantly. Cherokee have many friends among newspapermen in Denver, he explained. Men who pay good money for stories about corruption in high places. These papers, they would make very interesting reading for people who care about justice. Clara felt hope beginning to bloom in her chest for the first time in months. If the story broke in Denver, it would spread to other cities. Even if Caldwell tried to suppress it in Missouri, too many people would know the truth. More than that, Silas added, his strategic mind working. Once this becomes public knowledge, Caldwell loses his main weapon, secrecy. He can't have you killed to silence you if everyone already knows what you witnessed. The sound of distant gunfire interrupted their planning, reminding them that 4 armed men were still somewhere in the forest, probably regrouping for another attack. But for the first time since this ordeal began, Clara felt like they might actually have a path to victory. First, we survive the next few hours, Silas said, checking his rifle. Then we figure out how to destroy Henry Caldwell, using his own greed against him. Clara nodded, tucking the most important documents inside her shirt. And if we don't survive, then you make sure these papers get to Denver, Running Wolf said simply. Dead martyrs sometimes speak louder than living witnesses. It wasn't a comforting thought, but Clara found strength in it anyway. She'd spent months running from her past, but now she had the tools to turn and fight. Henry Caldwell had made the mistake of underestimating a scared bookkeeper, not realizing she might grow into something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The battle for her life was about to resume, but now it was also a battle for justice. And Clara Whitmore intended to win both. The surveyor's map had been Silas's father's, drawn during the early days of westward expansion when accurate charts of the Colorado Territory were worth their weight in gold. Every ridge, every hidden valley, every game trail and water source was marked with the meticulous precision of a man whose life depended on knowing the land intimately. Now, spread across the cabin table in the grey light before dawn, it represented their best hope of surviving what was to come. 4 men here, Running Wolf said, pointing to a cluster of symbols that indicated dense forest cover near a seasonal creek. They have good position, can see cabin, control main trails, but they don't know about this. His finger traced a barely visible line that wound behind the enemy position, following a deer path that skirted the base of the cliffs. Clara studied the map, her mind automatically calculating distances and elevation changes the way she once calculated ledger entries. How long would it take to reach them from behind? 2 hours if we move careful, Silas replied. Maybe less if we push hard, but pushing makes noise, and noise gets people killed. The remaining bounty hunters had regrouped after yesterday's skirmish, taking up positions that effectively had the cabin surrounded. They were professional enough to maintain discipline, patient enough to wait for the right opportunity. But patience was a luxury that worked both ways, and Clara's small group had advantages the enemy couldn't match: intimate knowledge of the terrain, the support of local tribes, and most importantly, the desperation of people fighting for their lives rather than their paychecks. "The letter needs to reach Denver regardless of what happens here," Clara said, touching the oilskin packet where they'd sealed the evidence of Henry Caldwell's crimes. "Even if we don't, if things go badly, people need to know the truth." "Running." Wolf nodded solemnly. "My cousin Greyhawk waits at the old trading post. If we don't return by sunset tomorrow, he carries the papers to Denver himself. Your story will be told, Clara Whitmore." The simple promise carried more weight than any, oath sworn on a dozen Bibles. Clara had learned that Running Wolf's word was absolute. When he said something would be done, it would be done, regardless of personal cost. The knowledge that her testimony would survive even if she didn't provided a strange sort of peace. "There's something else," Silas said quietly, his finger tracing defensive positions on the map. "Once we do this, once we go after them instead of just defending, there's no going back. They'll know we're not just hiding anymore, we're hunting. It changes the whole nature of the fight." Clara met his eyes steadily. "Good. I'm tired of being prey." The transformation in her still amazed him sometimes. The frightened woman who'd struggled with a broken wagon wheel had evolved into someone who could plan military tactics with calm precision. Not because she'd become hard or callous, but because she'd finally found something worth fighting for. Not just her life, but her right to live it on her own terms. They spent the morning in meticulous preparation, checking every weapon, counting ammunition, discussing contingencies for a dozen different scenarios. Clara cleaned her rifle with the careful attention of someone who understood that mechanical failure could mean death. The weapon had become familiar in her hands, no longer a foreign tool, but an extension of her will. "Remember," Silas said, as they made final preparations to leave the cabin, "we're not trying to be heroes. We go in quiet, hit them hard and fast, then get out. No unnecessary risks." "What about the marshal?" Clara asked. "He's the one with official authority. If we kill him, we become outlaws," Silas finished. "I know, but he stopped being a lawman the minute he took Caldwell's money to commit murder. Far as I'm concerned, he's just another hired gun with a fancy badge." Running Wolf emerged from the forest with his face painted in traditional Cherokee war colors, red and black stripes that transformed his weathered features into something primal and dangerous. He carried his grandfather's war club alongside more modern weapons, honoring old traditions while embracing practical necessities. "It's time," he said simply. Clara kissed Silas deeply before they left the cabin, pouring all her love and fear and hope into the contact. It might be the last time they had such a moment, and she wanted him to carry the memory of it into whatever came next. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love you too," he replied. "And we're going to get through this. We're going to build that life we talked about." Clara nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. "A bigger cabin, maybe some children." "Definitely children," Silas agreed with a smile that held all the warmth of summer sunlight. "Little ones who'll grow up free because their mother was brave, enough to fight for that freedom." They moved out in single file, Running Wolf leading with the silent grace of his ancestors, Silas covering the rear with the tactical awareness of his military experience, and Clara between them, no longer the protected but an equal partner in their small army. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and somewhere in the distance an eagle screamed its wild call across the peaks. The approach took longer than expected. Every few hundred yards, Running Wolf would stop and listen, reading signs in the forest that were invisible to white eyes. Twice he led them in wide detours around areas where the enemy might have posted sentries. Once he pointed out disturbed ground where someone had passed recently, adjusting their route to avoid walking into an ambush. As they drew closer to the enemy position, Clara felt the familiar pre-battle calm settling over her. Her breathing slowed, her senses sharpened, and the constant chatter of worry in her mind quieted to a focused stillness. She'd discovered over the past weeks that she possessed an unexpected talent for violence when it was necessary, not because she enjoyed it, but because she refused to be defeated by it. "There," Running Wolf whispered, pointing through a gap in the trees. Clara could see them now, 4 men positioned among the rocks and trees with clear sight lines toward the cabin. They looked relaxed, confident in their superior numbers and firepower. One was even smoking a pipe, the sweet tobacco scent drifting on the morning air. They were professionals, but they were also complacent, assuming they were hunting frightened civilians rather than facing opponents who'd learned to think tactically. That complacency was about to cost them everything. Silas hand signaled the attack plan they'd rehearsed, and Clara nodded her understanding. She would take the leftmost position, targeting the pipe smoker who seemed to be in command. Silas would handle the 2 men in the center, while Running Wolf dealt with the sentry. On the right flank, simultaneous shots, then rapid repositioning to avoid return fire. Simple, brutal, effective. Clara settled into firing position behind a fallen log, sighting down her rifle barrel at the unsuspecting man 70 yards away. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, her mind clear of everything except the necessity of what she was about to do. These men had come to kill her, had taken money to murder an innocent woman, to cover up crimes that included rape and murder. They deserved whatever happened next. The morning was so quiet she could hear her heartbeat in her ears. A hawk circled overhead, riding the mountain thermals with effortless grace. Somewhere in the distance, a stream chuckled over stones worn, smooth by centuries of patient water. Then Silas's whistle cut through the silence, 3 soft notes that meant execute. Clara squeezed the trigger, felt the rifle buck against her shoulder, saw her target pitch forward with a surprised grunt. Around her, Running Wolf's ancient war club crushed a skull, while Silas's Henry rifle spoke twice in rapid succession. The attack was over in seconds, professional and decisive. But as they moved to secure the area, Clara discovered something that chilled her more than the morning air. Fresh boot prints leading away from the camp, and a 5th set of saddlebags that suggested they'd been facing more enemies than they'd realized. There was another one, she called out urgently. Someone got away. Silas appeared beside her, studying the tracks with practiced eyes. Left maybe an hour ago, before we attacked. Could have been carrying word back to whoever's paying for this operation. Or bringing reinforcements, Running Wolf added grimly, examining the abandoned equipment. Look, Army surplus ammunition, professional-grade weapons. This was bigger operation than we thought. Clara felt the victory of their successful ambush evaporate like morning mist. They'd won this battle. But the war was far from over. Henry Caldwell had invested too much money and taken too many risks to give up now. If anything, the deaths of his hired killers would only make him more desperate to silence the only witness to his crimes. How long before more men arrive? She asked. Depends how far they have to travel, Silas replied, already thinking ahead. Could be days, could be weeks, but they'll come. Caldwell can't afford to let this go. The 3 of them worked quickly to gather intelligence from the dead men's belongings, finding maps, correspondence, and supplies that painted a clearer picture of what they were facing. The operation was even more extensive than they'd feared. Caldwell had hired not just bounty hunters, but military contractors, men with experience in the Indian Wars who knew how to track and kill in wilderness conditions. 12 men total, Running Wolf said, reading through a roster he'd found in the marshal's pack. These 4, the 2 we killed yesterday, and 6 more coming from the east with heavy weapons. Clara's blood ran cold. Heavy weapons, Mountain. Howitzer, Silas said grimly, examining a supply list. Small cannon, basically. They mean to shell us out of these mountains if they have to. The scope of Henry Caldwell's desperation was becoming clear. He wasn't just trying to silence a witness anymore. He was conducting a private war in federal territory, using hired mercenaries to commit mass murder. The evidence Clara carried was even more valuable than she'd realized, because it could connect Caldwell not just to individual crimes, but to treasonous conspiracy. "We need to get that evidence to Denver immediately," she said. "This has gone beyond personal vengeance." Caldwell's essentially declared war on the United States government. "No argument there," Silas agreed. "But first, we need to survive long enough to get the papers out of these mountains." Running Wolf studied the captured maps, his expression thoughtful. "There is way, dangerous but possible. The old mining road through Eagle Pass. It connects to the stage route to Denver. If we could reach it, we'd have to cross 40 miles of open country with trained killers hunting us," Silas finished. "And that's assuming the pass isn't already blocked." "Then we make sure it's not blocked," Clara said with quiet determination. "And we make sure Henry Caldwell learns what happens when you underestimate someone with nothing left to lose." The plan they developed over the next hour was audacious to the point of madness, but it had the virtue of being completely unexpected. Instead of running from their pursuers, they would circle back and attack the main force before it could establish positions around the cabin. Hit-and-run tactics, using their knowledge of the terrain to offset the enemy's superior numbers and firepower. "It's suicide," Silas said bluntly after they'd worked out the details. "Maybe," Clara agreed, "but it's suicide with a purpose, and it's better than waiting here to be slaughtered like sheep." As they prepared to abandon the cabin that had become home, Clara took one last look around the space where she'd found love and learned to fight for it. The simple furniture, the books on the shelf, the wildflowers she'd arranged just yesterday, all of it would probably be destroyed in the coming battle, collateral damage in Henry Caldwell's war against truth. But the important things, the love, the courage, the determination to build something better, those would survive regardless of what happened to wood and stone. "Ready?" Silas asked, shouldering his pack. Clara nodded, checking her rifle one final time. "Let's go remind Henry Caldwell why he should have left well enough alone." They disappeared into the forest like ghosts, leaving behind only an empty cabin and the promise of a reckoning that was long overdue. Silas's spyglass had served him well during his army scouting days, and it served him even better now as he studied the enemy column winding its way up the mountain trail. Through the precision ground lenses, he could see details that would have been invisible to the naked eye. The military bearing of the mercenaries, the professional way they maintained spacing and cover, the small wheeled cannon being hauled by a team of mules. "Professional soldiers," he murmured to Clara, who lay beside him on the rocky outcrop overlooking the approach route. "Not bounty hunters or hired thugs. These men have seen real combat." Clara peered through her own field glasses, counting the enemy force with the methodical precision she'd once applied to ledger books. "I make it 8 men, plus the artillery crew, all heavily armed." She paused, studying their movement patterns. "But they're being careful, too careful. They're afraid of ambush." "Good," Running Wolf said from his position, watching their back trail. "Fear makes men slow, makes them hesitate. We use their caution against them." The plan they'd developed was simple in concept, but demanded perfect execution. They would hit the column from 3 different positions simultaneously, creating confusion and panic in the narrow confines of the mountain trail. The key was timing. If they struck too early, the survivors would have room to maneuver and reorganize. Too late, and the enemy would reach the wider valley where their superior numbers could be brought to bear effectively. Clara checked her rifle for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, a nervous habit she'd developed during their weeks of preparation. The weapon felt familiar in her hands now, no longer the foreign tool it had once been, but an extension of her will. She'd become deadly accurate with it, a fact that still surprised her sometimes. The timid bookkeeper who'd fled St. Louis would never have imagined herself capable of planned violence, But that woman had died somewhere along the trail to becoming Clara Whitmore. "Remember," Silas said quietly as they prepared to move to their firing positions, "we're not trying to kill them all. We just need to break their cohesion, scatter them enough to create gaps we can exploit." "And if they don't scatter?" Clara asked. "Then we run like hell and hope we're faster than they are," he replied with grim humor. The waiting was the hardest part. Clara lay motionless behind the fallen tree trunk that would serve as her cover, watching the enemy column approach, with the measured pace of professionals who knew their business. Her mouth was dry despite the cool mountain air, and she could feel her heartbeat strong and steady in her ears. This was it, the moment that would determine whether she lived to see justice done or died as just another victim of Henry Caldwell's ambition. Through her field glasses, she could see the man she took to be the column's leader, a weathered veteran with sergeant's stripes on his faded uniform jacket. He rode at the front of the formation, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain, ahead for signs of danger. Behind him came the main body of mercenaries, their weapons held ready, their formation tight enough to provide mutual support, but loose enough to avoid presenting a concentrated target. The mountain howitzer brought up the rear, its bronze barrel gleaming dully in the afternoon sunlight. 2 men walked alongside the weapon, while 4 more guided the mule team, hauling it up the steep trail. Clara had never seen artillery used in combat, but she understood its purpose, to reduce the cabin and its surroundings to kindling if conventional. Assault failed. The thought of that small cannon destroying the home she'd built with Silas filled her with cold anger. Henry Caldwell had already taken so much from her, her reputation, her security, her ability to live openly under her own name. Now he wanted to destroy the sanctuary where she'd found love and learned to fight back. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. A hawk screamed somewhere overhead, and Clara took it as an omen. She was no longer prey. She was the hunter. Now, and it was time to prove it. The signal came as the enemy column reached the designated kill zone, a narrow section of trail where the mountain slope fell away sharply on one side and rose steeply on the other. Silas's whistle was barely audible above the wind, but Clara heard it clearly and squeezed her trigger in the same instant that Running Wolf's rifle cracked from across the ravine. Her target, one of the artillery crew, pitched sideways off the trail, his scream echoing off the canyon walls. Around her, chaos erupted as disciplined soldiers suddenly found themselves under attack from multiple directions. Horses reared and plunged, men shouted contradictory orders, and the tight formation began to dissolve into individual struggles. For survival, Clara worked the lever of her Henry rifle with smooth precision, sending shot after shot into the confusion below. She wasn't trying for careful aim now. The goal was to maintain pressure, to keep the enemy from regrouping and identifying her position. Brass cartridge cases ejected in golden arcs, and the smell of gunpowder began to fill the thin mountain air. A bullet splinged off the rock beside her head, reminding her that she was taking fire as well as giving it. The enemy had spotted her muzzle flashes and were returning fire with professional competence despite their initial surprise. Clara rolled sideways, found new cover behind a boulder, and continued shooting. Across the ravine, Running Wolf's position was marked by steady rifle fire and the occasional war whoop that seemed to unnerve the mercenaries more than bullets did. The Cherokee was using his grandfather's tactics, making himself seem like a larger force through noise and rapid movement between firing positions. Silas had positioned himself where he could cover the trail both above and below the kill zone, preventing the enemy from escaping or receiving reinforcements. His rifle spoke with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. Clara could see bodies scattered along the trail where his bullets had found their marks. But the enemy was adapting quickly, as professional soldiers do. The surviving sergeant had taken cover behind the howitzer and was shouting orders that gradually brought discipline back to his scattered men. Clara could see them beginning to organize, to identify firing positions and coordinate their response. "Time to move," she muttered to herself, recognizing the moment when staying in place would become suicidal. She began working her way along the ridge, using the broken terrain to mask her movement while continuing to fire when opportunities presented themselves. The enemy had superior numbers and firepower, but they were trapped on a narrow trail with limited options for maneuver. As long as she and her companions could maintain pressure from multiple angles, they could keep the mercenaries pinned down and demoralized. A bullet tugged at her sleeve, close enough that she could feel the heat of its passage. Clara dropped flat behind a cluster of rocks, her heart hammering with the sudden realization of how close she'd come to death. But when she looked up again, she saw something that made her smile grimly. The mule team pulling the howitzer had panicked and was dragging the gun back down the trail, effectively removing the enemy's most dangerous weapon from the fight. "That's right," she whispered, working the lever of her rifle again. "Run back to your master and tell him Clara Whitmore isn't as helpless as he thought." The battle was far from over, but for the first time since it began, Clara allowed herself to believe they might actually win. Clara's derringer was smaller than her palm, a delicate weapon that seemed almost toy-like compared to the heavy rifles and military weapons surrounding her. But as she pressed herself against the burning logs of what had once been her home, feeling the heat sear through her jacket, she knew that sometimes the smallest tools could deliver the most decisive blows. The battle had raged for 2 hours, moving from the narrow trail down into the valley and finally to the cabin itself, when the surviving mercenaries had made their desperate final assault. Silas was somewhere in the smoke and chaos, separated from her when a coordinated charge had broken their defensive line. Running Wolf had vanished into the forest after taking a bullet in the shoulder, leaving Clara to face the last phase of the fight alone. But she wasn't the same frightened woman who'd fled St. Louis 6 months ago. That woman would have cowered and waited for rescue. Clara Whitmore intended to write her own ending. "Come out, Catherine Walsh," called a voice from the other side of the burning cabin. She recognized it as belonging to the mercenary sergeant, the professional soldier who'd adapted quickly to their guerrilla tactics. "It's over. Your friends are dead or scattered. Surrender now, and I promise you'll make it back to Missouri alive." Clara almost laughed at the obvious lie. She'd seen the kill orders in Morrison's papers, knew that Henry Caldwell had paid for her death, not her capture. But the sergeant's words did tell her something useful. He thought Silas and Running Wolf were out of the fight, which meant he might be overconfident. "I have a better idea," she called back, checking the loads in her derringer. 2 shots, both at close range. She'd have to make them count. "Why don't you come in here and get me?" The response was a burst of rifle fire that sent splinters flying from the log walls around her. Clara pressed lower, feeling the heat from the burning roof timbers grow more intense. Soon the whole structure would collapse, and she'd have to move, whether she wanted to or not. A shadow moved past one of the windows, and Clara fired through the gap, hearing a grunt of pain and satisfaction that told her she'd hit something important. 1 shot left, and at least 2 enemies still moving around the perimeter of the cabin. Then she heard it. Silas's voice, raised in what sounded like surrender. "Don't shoot! I'm coming out unarmed!" Clara's heart clenched with terror and rage. If they had Silas, if they were using him as bait— "That's right, mountain man," the sergeant called out. "Nice and easy. Keep those hands where I can see them." Through a crack in the wall, Clara could see Silas emerge from the forest with his hands raised, his rifle conspicuously absent. But something about his posture, the way he held himself, suggested this wasn't the defeat it appeared to be. He was moving with purpose, drawing the enemy's attention exactly where he wanted it. "Now call out your woman," the sergeant ordered. "Tell her to come out before this whole place burns down around her." "Clara!" Silas shouted. "They've got me covered! It's over! Come out with your hands up!" But Clara heard what the sergeant didn't. The subtle emphasis on certain words, the coded message Silas had taught her during their planning sessions. "They've got me covered. meant he had backup positioned nearby. It's over meant the next phase of their plan was about to begin. Hands up meant she should be ready to move fast. Clara smiled grimly and shifted position, working her way toward the cabin's back wall where the fire hadn't yet reached. Through the gaps between logs, she could see the sergeant positioning himself to cover both Silas and the cabin entrance. Professional but predictable, he was thinking like a soldier, not like someone fighting for their life against impossible odds. "Catherine Walsh," the sergeant called again. "I know you're in there. Come out now or I put a bullet in your boyfriend's head." To emphasize his point, Clara heard the distinctive click of a rifle being cocked. The threat wasn't idle. She could see through the wall gap that the sergeant had his weapon aimed directly at Silas's chest. But she could also see something the sergeant couldn't: Running Wolf, moving like a ghost through the trees behind the mercenary position, his war paint making him nearly invisible in the dappled shadows. The shoulder wound hadn't slowed him down as much as they'd hoped. Clara took a deep breath and made her decision. "I'm coming out," she called, then immediately moved in the opposite direction, working her way toward the cabin's side wall, where the burning had created a gap large enough to slip through. "Hands where I can see them," the sergeant ordered as she emerged into the smoky clearing. Clara raised her hands, the derringer concealed in her right palm, and walked slowly toward where the sergeant held Silas at gunpoint. Behind the mercenary, she could see Running Wolf positioning himself for a clear shot, but the angle was wrong. Any bullet that missed might hit Silas as well. "That's far enough," the sergeant said when Clara was 10 feet away. "You know, you've caused a lot of trouble for a lot of people. Mr. Caldwell is very eager to see justice done." "Justice?" Clara laughed, the sound harsh in the smoke-filled air. "You mean like the justice Thomas Brennan got when Henry Caldwell caved in his skull with a paperweight?" The sergeant's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure. You do, just like you know that federal marshals don't normally take private contracts to commit murder. How much is Caldwell paying you to make sure I never see a courtroom?" "Enough," the sergeant replied. "More than enough to make this worth the trouble you've caused." Clara could see his finger tightening on the trigger, see the decision forming in his eyes. In seconds, both she and Silas would be dead, and Henry, Caldwell's secrets, would die with them. But she'd learned something important during her months in the wilderness. Sometimes the only way to win was to do something so unexpected that your enemy couldn't adapt fast enough to counter it. Instead of diving away or trying to run, Clara lunged forward, closing the distance between herself and the sergeant in 2 quick steps. His rifle swung toward her, but she was already inside its effective range, too close for him to bring the weapon to bear properly. The derringer bucked in her hand as she pressed it against his ribs and fired. The sergeant's eyes went wide with shock and pain, his own weapon discharging harmlessly into the air as he doubled over. "That's for Thomas Brennan," Clara said quietly, then stepped back as the man collapsed. Behind her, she heard Silas dealing with the remaining mercenary who'd been covering their rear. The sharp crack of a rifle shot, followed by the sound of a body hitting the ground. When she turned, Running Wolf was emerging from the forest, his weathered face painted in a grim smile. "It's finished," Silas said, lowering his smoking rifle. Clara looked around at the burning cabin, the scattered bodies, the evidence of violence that marked the end of their mountain sanctuary. Everything they'd built together was destroyed. But somehow she felt lighter than she had in months. The weight of fear, of constant looking over her shoulder, of running from shadows, all of it was finally lifting. "No," she said, pulling the packet of evidence from inside her shirt. "Now it's finished. Now Henry Caldwell faces justice for what he's done." The smoke from the burning cabin rose straight up in the still mountain air, a column of grey that could probably be seen for miles. But Clara wasn't worried about attracting attention anymore. Let the whole world see what had happened here. Let them know that some people couldn't be bought, intimidated, or silenced. Henry Caldwell had underestimated a frightened bookkeeper, not realizing she might grow into something far more dangerous, a woman who'd learned to fight for truth, justice, and the right to love freely in the wilderness she'd come to call home. The battle was over, but the war for justice was just beginning. 6 months later, the new wedding ring felt strange on Clara's finger, not because it was unwelcome, but because it represented something she'd never dared dream possible during those dark days of running and hiding. Carved from mountain cedar by Silas's patient hands, it was simple and perfect, a symbol of love that had grown strong in the wilderness and emerged stronger from the fire that had tested it. Their new cabin sat in a hidden valley 3 miles from the burned ruins of the old one, positioned where morning light would stream through the windows and the sound of the creek would provide a gentle soundtrack to their daily lives. It was larger than the first cabin, built with an eye toward the future, toward children who would grow up free and safe in these mountains, toward a life that stretched beyond mere survival into the realm of genuine happiness. Clara paused in her garden work to rest one hand on her gently swelling belly, feeling the first flutters of movement from the child growing within her. 7 months along now, and the miracle of new life still amazed her. After everything they'd endured, the fact that she and Silas had been blessed with this chance to create rather than simply survive felt like a gift from Providence itself. Letter came from Denver, Silas called from the cabin doorway, waving. A thick envelope that bore the letterhead of the Rocky Mountain News. Looks like official business. Clara dried her hands on her apron and walked over to join him, settling onto the bench they'd built on the front porch. The view from here encompassed the entire valley, rolling meadows where their horses grazed, stands of aspen that turned gold in autumn, and the snow-capped peaks that provided a backdrop of eternal beauty to their small corner of paradise. The letter was from James Morrison, the newspaper editor who'd become their unlikely ally in the campaign to expose Henry Caldwell's crimes. Clara smiled as she recognized his flowing handwriting, remembering the gruff but kindly man who'd taken their evidence and turned it into front-page headlines that had spread across the country like wildfire. "My dear friends," the letter began, "I trust this finds you well and settled in your new home. I'm writing to share news that I think will bring you considerable satisfaction." Clara read aloud while Silas listened, his arm around her shoulders as they rocked gently in the mountain breeze. Morrison's news was everything they'd hoped for, and more. Henry Caldwell had been convicted on multiple charges, including murder, conspiracy, and bribery of federal officials. His son William faced similar charges, and both men were looking at lengthy prison sentences that would ensure they never again posed a threat to anyone. "The trial was a sensation," Morrison continued. "Your testimony, delivered by affidavit since you couldn't safely travel to St. Louis, was the key evidence that convinced the jury. Caldwell's lawyers tried every trick in the book, but the documentary evidence you provided was simply too overwhelming to dismiss. Justice has finally been served, but perhaps the most satisfying news was saved for last. I'm pleased to inform you that the state of Missouri has formally dismissed all charges against Catherine Walsh and issued a public apology for the harassment she endured. Your name has been cleared completely, Mrs. McGraw, and you're free to travel anywhere in the United States without fear of legal consequence." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she read those words. Catherine Walsh, that frightened, hunted woman, was finally officially dead. In her place stood Clara McGraw, wife, expectant mother, and survivor of trials that had forged her into someone stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. "There's more," she continued reading. "The state of Colorado has granted you full title to your homestead, recognizing your claim based on improvement and occupancy. You are now the legal owners of 320 acres in the territory, with all rights and privileges thereof." Silas let out a whoop of joy that echoed across the valley. "We own it, Clara. All of this, the land, the cabin, the future we're building, it's really ours." Running Wolf emerged from the forest at the sound of Silas's celebration, his weathered face creased in a questioning smile. When they explained the news, he nodded approvingly and settled beside them on the porch steps. "Good," he said simply. "The land chooses its people, not the other way around. You belong here now." They talked until sunset, sharing plans for the future and memories of the trials that had brought them to this moment. Running Wolf had become a frequent visitor to their new home, helping with construction and hunting, but more than that, he'd become family in the way that sometimes happens when people face danger together and emerge stronger for it. As the stars began to appear above the mountain peaks, Clara found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her here. The frightened bookkeeper who'd fled St. Louis seemed like someone from another lifetime. A woman who'd never imagined she could love as deeply as she loved Silas, never dreamed she could find the courage to fight for justice against impossible odds. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd never found that broken wagon wheel?" Silas asked, as if reading her thoughts. Clara smiled and turned to face him, seeing her own contentment reflected in his eyes. "I think we would have found each other somehow. People like us, people who've been broken and learned to heal, we recognize each other across any distance, even when we smell like honest sweat and hard work," Silas teased, echoing his first crude words to her on that long-ago morning that had changed both their lives. "Especially then," Clara laughed, leaning up to kiss him softly. "That's when we know we've found someone worth keeping." The baby kicked against her ribs, as if in agreement, and Clara rested both hands on her belly with a sense of wonder that never seemed to fade. This child would grow up knowing both parents, would learn to read from her mother and to hunt from her father, would understand from the very beginning that love was worth fighting for and that justice was worth any price. "What should we name the baby?" she asked, as they watched the moon rise above the eastern peaks. "If it's a boy, maybe Thomas," Silas said quietly. After your son," Clara finished gently. "I'd like that. And if it's a girl, Margaret Catherine," he replied without hesitation. "For both the women who've made my life worth living." Clara felt her heart swell with gratitude, not just for Silas's love, but for his willingness to honor the past while building toward the future. He'd learned, as she had, that healing didn't require forgetting, that love could expand to encompass loss without being diminished by it. The sound of coyotes began to drift across the valley, their wild songs mixing with the creek's gentle murmur and the whisper of wind through the pines. Clara had come to love that sound. It spoke of freedom, of wildness preserved, of a place where people could still build lives according to their own dreams rather than others' expectations. "Thank you," she said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure who she was addressing, Silas, the mountain itself, or the providence that had guided her through darkness into light. "For what?" Silas asked. "For everything, for finding me, for protecting me, for teaching me that I was worth protecting, for showing me that sometimes the best way to heal from the past is to build something beautiful in the present." Silas kissed the top of her head, his arms tightening around her as their child stirred within her. "Thank you for letting me find you again," he murmured, "for showing me that love doesn't end with loss. It just grows deeper and more precious with time." Above them, the Milky Way stretched across the clear mountain sky like a river of stars, and Clara Whitmore McGraw smiled as she contemplated the future spreading out before them like an unwritten story waiting to be filled with joy, adventure, and the quiet satisfaction of work well done in the service of love. The wilderness had tested them both, but it had also made them into the people they were always meant to become. And now, in this hidden valley where eagles soared and wildflowers bloomed and honest sweat was just another word for the labor of love, they would build a legacy that would endure long after the mountains themselves had forgotten the trials that had brought them home.